His rifle was up before his eyes opened. She stood at his table, Apache and calm, watching him without fear. That one mercy on a trail would change everything. The man who had asked for nothing would find the one thing he had stopped believing in. His name was Caleb Hurst, and he ranched alone in the high Mescalero country of southeastern New Mexico territory, the autumn of 1878. He had no family left to speak of, no neighbor within 8 miles, and a reputation among the ranchers in Lincoln County for being decent but closed off. A man who kept his word and kept his distance in equal measure. He had come to the territory young, after the war, chasing the kind of quiet that only wide land can give a man who has seen too much. Now watch till the end. Like what you're watching, subscribe. We'll go back to the beginning. It had started 4 days before that morning, on the long, dry stretch of the Mescalero Trail south of Ruidoso, where the pinyon pine grows sparse, and the afternoon heat comes off the rocks like a fever. Caleb was moving a small herd down to the lower pasture before the first hard frost. He had 3 horses, 2 dogs, and a water bladder that was more than half full when he spotted the man. He almost didn't stop. The man was lying face down in the red dirt at the edge of the trail, off to the side behind a cluster of sage. Caleb saw the moccasins first, then the stillness. He reined his horse, sat there a moment listening to nothing but wind and the low protest of cattle, and rode over. The man was Apache, old, maybe 60, maybe older, with a face weathered by decades of high desert sun and a long gray-streaked braid that had come partly loose. He was breathing, barely. There was blood soaked through the left side of his shirt, a wound days old by the look and smell of it. A horse had carried him some distance and then left him, or he had fallen and crawled here. There was no water on him, no pack, no weapon, nothing but a beaded cord around his wrist and a small medicine pouch tied at his belt. Caleb climbed down. He did not ask himself why he stopped. A man either has that reflex or he doesn't, and Caleb had it. The same impulse had made him drag a Confederate drummer boy from a creek bed once in Virginia, back when he was 17 years old, and the war had not yet taught him to stop caring. He had never been able to explain it. He just couldn't leave a man dying in the dirt. He uncapped the water bladder and lifted the old man's head and gave him water slowly, the way you do it when someone has been dry too long. The man's eyes opened, black and deep, alert behind the haze of pain. He looked at Caleb the way you look at something you weren't expecting to see. Caleb tore 2 long strips from the back of his own shirt. He pressed them firm against the wound, tied them with a piece of leather from his saddlebag, and talked to the man in a low voice the whole time. Not because he thought the man understood English, but because quiet felt wrong, and he had nothing else to offer. He built a small fire. He stayed. He sat there in the pinyon shade through the heat of the afternoon and into the evening, giving water in careful amounts, watching the man's breathing, keeping the dogs back. Sometime before midnight the old man spoke. His voice was thin but deliberate, the words in Mescalero Apache, short phrases, measured. He looked directly at Caleb while he spoke, which told Caleb whatever it was, it mattered. The old man's eyes closed again before morning. By first light he was gone. Caleb sat with him for a time, then did the only thing that seemed right. He dug a shallow grave in the red earth with his camp shovel, laid the old man in it wrapped in his own bedroll, and marked it with a cairn of white stones from the dry creek bed. He left the beaded cord on the man's wrist. He did not know the custom, but leaving it felt correct. He moved the herd down to the pasture. He went home. He told no one, because there was no one to tell. He thought about it for 2 days, the way you turn a thing over without arriving anywhere, and then he stopped thinking about it. 4 days after the trail, he was asleep before dawn when he heard the door. Not a knock. The sound of the latch. His rifle was up before his eyes were fully open. Military instinct that had never quite left him. He rolled to sitting on the edge of the cot, weapon raised, and in the gray pre-light coming through the single east window, he saw her. She stood near the kitchen table, still, an Apache woman, young, not much past 20, wearing a doe-skin dress, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, a short knife at her belt. She had not drawn it. She was watching him with calm, steady eyes that showed neither fear nor aggression. A woman who had walked a long way and was not surprised to find a rifle pointed at her. Caleb's fingers stayed off the trigger. Something in her stillness stopped him. "How did you get here?" he said. It came out flat, not a question. "The door," she said. Her English was careful, each word placed like a stone. "I knocked. You did not wake." He lowered the rifle by half. "Who are you?" "My name is Nahda," she said. "My father was Luca. He was a healer of the Mescalero. He died on the trail to Ruidoso 4 days ago, beside a piñon grove." She paused. "You stayed with him." Caleb set the rifle across his knees. He didn't speak. Before his spirit left, she said, "He spoke. There were riders nearby, 2 of my people, far enough that they could not reach him in time, but close enough to see. They heard what he said." She met Caleb's eyes steadily. He said a white man with a brown horse stopped. That the man gave water, tore his own clothing to bind the wound, and sat with him through the night, and built a fire, and marked the ground. She let the words settle in the cold quiet of the cabin. "Among my people such a thing cannot go unanswered. A kindness given freely must be returned in kind. That is our way." Caleb said nothing for a moment. The dogs had come in from the back room and were sitting behind him, reading the air. "I didn't do it expecting anything back," he said. "I know that," Nahda said. "That is why it matters." He asked her what she wanted. She said that was the wrong question. She said the question was what he needed. She said she had come to work the land beside him through the cold months, to honor the life debt her father's spirit carried. A debt unpaid is a weight that stays with the dead, and she would not have her father's spirit walk heavy. She would stay through spring. After that, she would decide. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said. "No," she agreed. "I do not. I am not traded like a horse rancher. I chose this path. There is a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the sky was going pale pink above the Sacramentos. "There's a room off the back," he said. "It has a door with a latch." She nodded. "I saw it." He put the rifle back on its pegs and went to start the fire. The first week was not easy. It wasn't supposed to be. Nahda kept to herself in the mornings, rising before Caleb and starting the cook fire, then moving to whatever task needed doing without being asked. She had a rancher's eye for work. She could read what a place needed the way a doctor reads a patient, quickly and without sentiment. She mended the fence along the north pasture. She cleaned the tack. She found where the feed sacks were rotting at the base from moisture and moved them without comment. Caleb watched her work and felt the particular discomfort of a man who doesn't know whether to help or stay out of the way. He chose, mostly, to stay out of the way. They had meals together out of practical necessity. 1 fire, 1 table, 1 set of cooking gear. Those first meals were quiet, in the way that isn't peaceful, just compressed. Caleb asked short questions. Nahda gave short answers. He passed things across the table without being asked. She refilled his coffee before he got up for it. The town of Crestfield was 12 miles north on the stage road, and Caleb had to go for supplies on the 8th day. He took the wagon alone and came back to find that Nahda had patched the roof over the lean-to with pine boards she'd cut and shaped by hand from the scrap timber behind the barn. He stood in the yard for a moment looking at it, then at her. "The gap was letting water in," she said. "It was," he said. He put the horse up without another word. In Crestfield he had said nothing about her. He didn't know how to begin. The people he knew there, the storekeeper Garrett, the blacksmith's wife, a couple of the Cavalmen's Association men who drank at the same saloon. They were decent enough in their way, but the territory had a long and ugly memory of conflict with the Apache bands, and opinion moved slow. He had learned, over years, not to expect it to move at all. He was right to be careful. He spent the first week also carrying something he hadn't anticipated. Guilt. Not guilt about having her there. Something older and quieter than that. He would be working the pasture in the morning light, and he'd think about Luca, about the sounds the old man had made in the dark, and the way his hand had moved slightly when Caleb poured the water, as if reaching for something he knew wasn't there. He thought about the medicine pouch. He had left the beaded cord because it seemed right, but the pouch he had not moved, not knowing whether to leave it or take it to the grave with him. And in his uncertainty he had left it too. He wondered if that had been wrong. He wondered if the people who came for the body had been angry at what they found, or at what they hadn't. He thought about asking Nahda. He didn't. The subject of her father sat between them in those first days like a thing neither of them was ready to pick up and examine in the light. She, too, carried something. He could see it when she didn't know he was watching. A flatness in her face when the day's work was finished, and she had nothing to hold her attention, a moment of blankness that passed quickly and left no trace, the way grief moves through a person who has been trained to keep moving. She was disciplined about it. She had probably been disciplined about it since before she could walk. But one morning, early in the second week, she didn't come out of her room at the usual hour. Caleb started the fire himself, made the coffee, and waited. After 20 minutes, he knocked on the door softly. No answer, but he heard her breathing, slow and deliberate, the way people breathe when they're trying to be quiet, so no one worries about them. He left a cup of coffee on the floor outside the door without saying anything. When she came out an hour later, her face was composed and her sleeves were straight. She picked up the cup, found it cold, and drank it anyway. He didn't say a word. She didn't either. They went about the day. He understood what had happened. She had kept a vigil for her father, privately, the way her people did. The Mescalero observed the mourning period with specific rituals. 4 days after death, then markers at intervals. Nahda was far from her band, and she kept what she could keep alone. He had no right to that space and didn't try to enter it. He only made sure there was coffee outside the door the next morning, and the one after, and the ones after that. She noticed. She said nothing about it. He suspected that was its own kind of gratitude. On his second supply run, Garrett asked him straight if it was true he had an Apache woman living out at his place. Word traveled on the high desert the way it always does on the wind, with embellishment. Caleb said yes, she was working the ranch through winter, helping with the repairs. Garrett looked at him the way men look at you when they've already decided what they think and are just waiting to be confirmed. People are going to talk, Caleb. People talk about everything, Caleb said. He paid for his goods and left. In the second week he started learning words. He couldn't say exactly when he decided to do it. One evening after supper, Nahda said something under her breath in Apache while she was washing the pan. A phrase, short, that sounded like the end of a longer thought, and he asked her what it meant. She looked at him a moment, surprised, then told him. It meant, roughly, the work is finished, and the day was honest. He said it back, badly. She corrected the vowel. He said it again. From then on, most evenings after the fire burned low, Caleb would ask her to teach him a word or a phrase, and she would. He kept them written on a small piece of card in his breast pocket, reviewing them while he worked. He learned the word for water, and for horse, and for thank you, and then for stranger, and for home, and for the kind of silence that means trust is growing. Some words, she said, had no English equivalent, and she would pause, searching, and then describe them by what they felt like rather than what they meant. He listened. He remembered. In return, he talked. Not much, but more than he was used to. He told her about Ohio, where he was from, about the farm his family had worked before the war, about his younger brother who had died at Cold Harbor, which was a thing Caleb had never spoken to anyone in the territory. He didn't plan to say it. It came out while he was setting fence posts one afternoon, with Nahda working the wire 20 feet away, and once it was out he let it stay there in the air. She didn't rush to fill the space with sympathy. She said, after a moment, that her father had lost a son too, 3 winters back, in a fever, that he had carried it like a stone in his chest until the end. Grief that size doesn't leave, Caleb said. No, she said, but it changes shape. He drove the next post, and didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There was a late November afternoon when a storm came down fast off the Sacramentos. Not a blizzard, just a hard, mean sleet that arrived without much warning and soaked everything in under an hour. Caleb was out on the east side of the property when it hit, moving water in the irrigation channel, and by the time he got back to the yard he was soaked through and cold in the way that gets in behind the shoulders and stays. Nahda was on the porch. She had already pulled the saddles inside and covered the feed bins with canvas and fed the dogs. She took one look at him and handed him a piece of folded wool blanket she'd warmed by the fire. He stood there in the sleet with the blanket in his hands. Go inside, she said. He went inside. He sat by the fire for a while, thawing out, and listened to the sleet coming off the roof, and thought about the fact that she had anticipated 3 things he'd have needed to do himself in the next 20 minutes, and done them all without being asked, and that the blanket was warm and smelled faintly of the herbs she kept in her room. He didn't think about it for long. He was the kind of man who noticed things and then put them away in an orderly fashion, and that was what he did. But he didn't put it far. Around that same time, he started finding small things done differently at the cabin that he hadn't asked for and didn't expect. A bundle of dried sage hung near the door, not for decoration, but to clear the air after cooking, the way her people did in winter dwellings. A worn horsehide rug appeared near the stove, salvaged from the barn scrap pile, which made the floor bearable on cold mornings. The wood pile had been restacked in a cross pattern he didn't recognize that apparently kept it drier in wet weather. He tried the pattern himself on the next load, and it worked. He said nothing about any of this. She said nothing either. Things appeared. Things improved. That was the shape of it. One evening he came in from checking the cattle to find her sitting at the table, turned sideways on the bench, looking out the window at the dark sky. She had a piece of rawhide in her hands, and she was working it, but her hands had stopped moving. She was watching something he couldn't see. He sat down across from her and waited. "My father used to say," she said after a while, without turning, "that the stars over the Sacramentos are closer than anywhere else he'd been, that the mountain brings you up to them." She paused. "I don't know if that is true. I think it was something he said to make the cold feel purposeful." "It's a decent thing to say," Caleb said. He had a lot of decent things. She turned from the window. "He was wiser than I am." "You're wiser than you give yourself credit for," Caleb said. "He meant it without sentiment, the way you state a fact you've verified." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she picked up the rawhide and went back to working it. He got up to check the fire. Outside, the stars over the Sacramentos were very close. He didn't remark on that. Nahda knew plants the way Caleb knew terrain, completely, without effort, from the marrow out. She had been trained by her father since childhood in the Mescalero tradition of plant medicine. The Apache healers of the Sacramento range worked with what the high desert offered: osha root for breathing, yucca for pain in the joints, sumac berries for fever, wild onion to draw infection from wounds, the inner bark of willow stripped and boiled to thin the blood. Her father had known 300 plants by sight and use. She had inherited most of that knowledge. She pointed out plants on the land that Caleb had walked past for years without knowing what they were. She dug osha from the rocky soil near the creek and dried it on the porch rail. She showed him which berries the deer avoided and why. One morning she found a ewe with a leg wound gone septic from a wire cut, and she cleaned and dressed it with a poultice of prickly pear pulp and charcoal ash, and the ewe was walking without a limp by the 4th day. Caleb watched that happen and reconsidered certain things he thought he knew. He asked her about the poultice. He sat across from her that evening and asked her to explain it step by step, and she did. The ratio of pulp to ash, the reason for charcoal, it pulls, she said, the same way soil pulls water. The particular way to apply it so the wound breathes but doesn't lose the draw. He wrote some of it down. She watched him write and seemed to approve of the fact that he was not embarrassed to admit he didn't know something. "Your father taught you all of this," he said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Most of it," she said. "Some I learned after he was gone. There are things you only learn when you have to." She thought for a moment. "He taught me to begin from what I can see and know for certain, not from what I hope is true. He said hope is useful for endurance. It is a bad guide for medicine." "That's good advice for more than medicine," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. He thought so too. He added a word to the card in his breast pocket that evening. Not an Apache word, just the word healer, in English, and beside it he wrote the name Luca, because it seemed wrong not to write it somewhere, in someone's hand. On a clear morning in mid-December, the first real snow of the season came down in the night and left 4 inches on everything. Caleb went out at first light and found Nahda already in the yard, standing very still in the middle of the white, looking out at the Sacramentos where the peaks had disappeared into low gray cloud. Her arms were at her sides. She was wearing her wool blanket loose around her shoulders, and the snow was still falling, slow and scattered. He came up beside her and stood there too. "The first snow is important," she said. "To your people." "Yes. The first snow means the medicines collected before winter were enough, that the preparations held." She looked out at the peaks. "My father always said a prayer on the first morning of snow. I don't know all the words anymore. I know the beginning of it." She said it quietly, in Mescalero Apache, 3 lines. Her voice was even and low. It was not a performance. She said it the way you say something that belongs to the air. He stood beside her in the snow and let the prayer go where it was going. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him sideways. "Did you understand any of it?" "One word," he said. "The word for sky." The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. It was the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her that wasn't connected to the dogs doing something foolish. He went to start the fire. She followed, and they made breakfast together, eggs from the 3 hens that had survived the cold, and cornbread from the bag of meal on the shelf, and ate it at the table while the snow kept coming down outside, and the cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the dried sage at the door. They started making coffee together in the evenings. She had shown him halfway through the 2nd week that she made it differently. Less water, longer on the heat, with a small pinch of dried sumac stirred in that took the bitterness out. He had made it her way the next morning without being asked, and she'd said nothing, just taken the cup, but he noticed that she wrapped both hands around it, the way you do with something that's right. Trust is a thing that grows slowly in cold country, like grass through stone working through small cracks. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced. It just appears one morning and you realize it's been there for a while. By early December he realized he had stopped bracing himself when he heard her move around the cabin. He had stopped noticing the small differences in their habits as differences at all. The coffee was made one way, the fire was banked in a certain pattern that held the heat longer, a pattern she had shown him. The dogs had adopted her completely, which dogs do when they've made an accurate read of someone. He had stopped asking himself what the arrangement looked like from the outside. He had started caring more about what it was from the inside. In the 3rd week of December, the trouble arrived. Caleb came home from the north pasture one afternoon to find 4 horses tied at his fence and 4 men on his porch. He recognized 2 of them, Dorn Fitch, who ran a cattle operation east of Crestfield, and his younger brother Ray, who was mostly known for following Dorn around and agreeing with him. The other 2 were men he didn't know, range riders by the look of their gear. Nahda was standing in the doorway. She had not backed inside. Her arms were at her sides. Caleb rode up at a walk and dismounted. He stood between the fence and the porch steps, looking at Fitch, Dorn, Caleb. Fitch took his hat off and resettled it, which was a habit he had when he was working himself up to something. "People in town are concerned." "About what?" "About you housing a Mescalero woman out here. About what kind of message that sends." "It sends the message that I run my land the way I see fit," Caleb said. "She needs to go," Fitch said, "before this becomes a problem for the whole county. We've been at peace with the Mescalero 3 years. Arrangements like this stir things up. People get ideas." "Which people?" Fitch didn't answer that specifically. The 2 riders Caleb didn't know had moved slightly, not far, but enough that Caleb noted it. He kept his eyes on Fitch. "You should leave," Caleb said. "Caleb, be reasonable. You're on my land without invitation. I've asked you to leave. I'll ask once more." Fitch's jaw tightened. He looked past Caleb at Nahda, then back at Caleb, with the particular expression of a man who doesn't like being told no and isn't certain yet how far to push it. "Think about what you're doing," Fitch said. "I am," said Caleb. The 4 men rode out. Caleb stood in the yard watching them go until they were a dust trail on the road. Then he turned. Nahda was still in the doorway. "This will come back," she said. "Probably," he said. He went inside. It came back 3 weeks later, in January, on the coldest night of that winter. Caleb had been fighting a fever for 2 days. He'd said nothing to Nahda about it, the way men of that time and disposition said nothing about physical weakness, until they stopped being able to hide it. He was at the barn before dawn, tending the horses in the hard cold, and he lost his footing on the ice near the water trough and went down. He lay there a moment in the dark, the cold of the ground coming up through his coat, and realized he couldn't get up under his own power. Nahda found him. She had seen the lantern go still in the barn window when it should have been moving, and something in that stillness read wrong to her. She came across the yard in the dark and found him on the frozen ground, shaking hard, his lips pale, the fever spiking the way fevers do when the body finally gives out its last reserve. She did not panic. She assessed, the way her father had taught her to assess, quickly, without sentiment, with the part of the mind that stays clear. She got him inside. That part was not small. He was a large man, heavier than her by considerable measure, and the distance from barn to cabin was 60 feet over icy ground. She did it with a rope from the barn looped under his arms, planted her feet and moved him, talking to him in a low, steady voice the whole time, keeping him conscious. She had him inside and onto the cot before 20 minutes had passed. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. She broke the fever with willow bark tea, made strong, spooned into him small amounts every few minutes, and wild onion compress on his chest and the back of his neck. She stoked the fire to exactly the right heat, hot enough to warm the room, but not so hot the body fought it. She watched his breathing with the same attention her father had given to every patient he'd ever treated. Caleb came fully conscious around mid-morning. He was weak and soaked through, and his chest hurt, but the fever had broken. Nahda was sitting in the chair beside the cot, awake, her hands folded in her lap. She had been there all night. "You were going to say nothing about being sick?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I thought it would pass," he said. "Men always think that." She handed him the tea. "Drink all of it." It was that afternoon, when the worst of the cold had lifted slightly and Caleb was sitting up against the wall, that they came. 8 riders. Fitch was among them. There were others he half recognized from Crestfield, and 2 men with badges pinned to their coats. Not county law, which Caleb knew, but something unofficial, the kind of badge that gets deputized for particular purposes and handed back after. They stopped in the yard. Caleb stood at the window, still sick, still barely steady on his feet. "I can go out," Nahda said. He was pulling his coat on, reaching for the rifle, when the sound came from the south side of the property. Horses. Not 8. More, maybe 20. He moved to the south window. Apache riders. A dozen at least, sitting their horses on the ridge above the creek, wrapped in blankets, rifles and bows visible. Watching the yard. Nahda stood beside him at the window. She looked out at her people, still and deliberate, positioned with the absolute calm of people who had decided where they stood and had nothing to prove beyond that. "My father had friends," she said quietly, "people who loved him. They have been watching this place since I came here. I asked them to keep distance." She paused. "I stopped asking them that when Fitch came the first time." Caleb looked at her. "You could have told me," he said. "You had enough to carry," she said. He turned back to the window. In the yard, Fitch had seen the ridge. His horse had shifted under him, reading what the rider hadn't processed yet. The men with the unofficial badges were very still. Caleb opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch. He was still sick. He could feel it in his legs. But he stood straight. "I'm only going to say this once," he said. "This woman is here by choice and by her own right. She owes me nothing, and I owe her more than I can measure. You ride onto my land again, with or without badges, there will be consequences I won't apologize for." He looked at Fitch. "Go home, Dorn." For a long moment nobody moved. Then, slowly, Fitch turned his horse. The others followed. The 2 men with the unofficial badges went last. Nobody said a word. The Apache riders on the ridge waited until Fitch's party had cleared the road north. Then they turned and rode quietly back into the Sacramentos. No ceremony, no announcement. They had come, they had stood, they had left when the matter was finished. Caleb came back inside and sat down because his legs had decided they were done. Nahda put the tea back in his hand. "That was a foolish thing to do," she said. "Standing out there sick." "Probably," he said. "You could have sent me." "No," he said. "I couldn't." She looked at him for a moment over the rim of her own cup, not with surprise, with the look of someone who already knew what they were seeing but was measuring whether to name it out loud. She didn't name it out loud. Not that day. What she did was sit down in the chair beside the cot and stay there through the rest of the afternoon. and make sure he drank the tea and ate something by evening, and tended the fire at exactly the right level so the room held its warmth through the night. 2 days after Fitch's riders had come and gone, when Caleb was well enough to sit outside in the pale winter sun, he asked Nahda something he'd been turning over since the moment he'd seen the Apache riders on the ridge. "How many of them were there?" he said. 14, she said. "Your father's friends. And their sons," she said. "And 2 of his cousins. And a woman named Itza, who was his oldest student. She came farthest." She paused. "She is better than I am with the plants. She would have been his successor if he had stayed with the main band." Caleb looked out at the south ridge. From where he sat he could see the line the horses had cut in the snow, 14 sets of tracks coming down the slope, and then going back up, clean and decisive. "You could have told them to stay away," he said. "That I could handle it. I thought about it," she said. "Then I thought about your face that afternoon when Fitch came the first time, and how you stood in the yard between him and the door, and how you are the kind of man who would stand there sick or well and never ask for anything." She looked at him. "My father would have said that a man who will not accept help cannot be truly helped. He said that about patience mostly. It applies." Caleb sat with that. "What do I owe them?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "They came because they chose to, same as me." He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was thin and cold, and it made her face clear in a way the lantern light never quite did, every line sharp, her eyes the color of dark water. He had known her for 2 months now, or close to it. He had watched her work and grieve and teach and stay. He knew the shape of her patience, the particular way she moved when she was certain of something, the difference between her silence that was peace and her silence that was thinking. He knew her. "That was not nothing. You said you'd decide in spring," he said. "Yes, you have time yet." "I have some," she said, "but I have been deciding since November." He didn't ask her what she'd decided. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and she knew it, and she let him have his time. He was grateful for that. She gave him room the way someone gives room to a wild thing that is learning to trust, not with pity, not with strategy, just patience and steadiness. Just by being steady, he had not encountered that before. He had not known, before her, that he had needed it. In February, when the worst of the winter had passed and the slopes of the Sacramentos were still white, but the air was starting to carry the first thin smell of coming spring, Nahda told Caleb she had made a decision. She had decided to stay, not through the season, not in fulfillment of a debt. She had said the morning she arrived that she would decide in spring, and spring was coming, and she had decided. She told him this at the kitchen table in the morning, while the coffee was making its noise on the stove. She said it plainly, the way she did most things, without decoration, without waiting to see if the moment was right. "The debt is paid," she said, "many times over. What stays now stays because I choose it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table, at the grain of the wood. Then he looked up. "I don't know what I have to offer," he said. "I'm not a man with much to spare. This is a hard piece of land in a hard part of the territory. I don't have money or standing or anything that would seem like much from the outside." "From the outside," she said. "Yes. I'm not asking from the outside," she said. He held her eyes for a moment, and then he nodded. Once, slowly. That evening, when the sun was going down behind the Sacramentos in long orange bands, and the air was the kind of cold that doesn't hurt anymore, just clarifies, they sat by the fire outside. Caleb had built it in the old ring of stones near the fence, the kind of fire you build to sit beside rather than to cook on. Nahda had brought her father's beaded cord, the same one Caleb had left on the old man's wrist, which 2 of the Apache riders had recovered from the cairn and returned to her when she came to the ranch. She held it in her hands for a moment. Then she tied it around both their wrists together. Not tight, just resting there, the way the Mescalero mark what they're calling a commitment. A binding without words, because some things are too large for words and too real for ceremony. Caleb looked at the cord. He looked at her. He turned his hand slowly so his palm was facing up. She placed her hand in his. They sat there in the firelight with the Sacramentos dark above them, and the cold stars coming out one at a time, and neither of them said anything for a long while. and the fire burned down and they did not move. Later, inside, he would make the coffee her way. She would sit at the table while it steeped. The dogs would settle by the stove. The lantern would cast its familiar yellow light across the kitchen boards, and the space would feel exactly the same as it always had, and also completely different, and there would be no way to explain that to anyone who wasn't there. There is a particular thing that happens when two people from separate worlds that were supposed to stay separate, find that they fit together without asking permission. It is not a loud thing. It announces nothing. It doesn't ask the county for approval, or wait for the right climate or calculate the odds. It just grows, like grass through stone, patient and stubborn, finding the light through whatever small opening is offered. Caleb Hurst had stopped on a trail for a dying man he didn't know, because the reflex to stop was in him and had nowhere else to go. He had given water and cloth and a piece of his own warmth, and sat in the dark with a stranger and asked for nothing. Nahda had walked 12 miles across hard country to honor what that meant among her people. She had come by choice, which is the only way any of it works. She had stayed because the man she found was worth staying for, and she was not a woman who confused duty with desire or mistook one for the other. The debt her father's spirit carried had been paid back long before the cord was tied. What they built after that was not a debt. It was not a reward. It was not a rescue or an obligation or a gesture. It was two people at a kitchen table in a cabin in the Mescalero country, making coffee in the cold morning and deciding each day to keep showing up. That was enough. That was everything. Outside, the mountains stood exactly as they always had, indifferent and enormous, and the high desert spread in every direction without apology. And somewhere on the south ridge, the horses were moving in the early light, and the world went on in its usual way. The only thing that had changed was everything.